Most of us grew up hearing about the mark of Cain as shorthand for disgrace, a permanent stain, something branded onto a murderer so the world would always know what he'd done. Proof that even when God spares your life, he still makes sure you carry the shame of it visibly, forever. It's an understandable read. The man killed his own brother. A visible sign of guilt fits the moral logic we bring to the story before we ever open the text. But go back to Genesis 4 and look closely at what the verse actually says the mark was for. Not so people would know what he did. Not so he would be shamed. The text gives one stated purpose, and only one, so that no one who found him would kill him. It's not framed as exposure, it's framed as protection. And once you notice that, a strange question opens up. Because in Genesis, that word, sign, doesn't show up only here. It shows up again a few chapters later, over a rainbow, and again after that, in the ritual that seals God's covenant with Abraham. So which is it? A mark of shame, or something else entirely, wearing shame's reputation by accident? To answer that, we have to go back further than Cain's punishment. We have to go back to the world he's standing in when God speaks that word over him, because the mark doesn't happen in isolation. It happens at the end of a very specific chain of events, and the shape of that chain matters. There is no king in this world, no empire, no border, no calendar year we can pin to a wall. Genesis 4 sits inside what scholars often call Israel's primeval history, the earliest chapters of Scripture, set before any of the datable history that follows later in Genesis and beyond. This isn't a story we can locate on a timeline the way we might locate the reign of a Judean king centuries later. The text doesn't offer that kind of anchor, and it's worth saying plainly, any attempt to pin an exact date on this moment goes beyond what the passage itself gives us. What the text does give us is smaller and more human. Two brothers, two ways of making a living. Cain works the ground. He's a farmer, tied to soil and season. Abel keeps sheep, a herder, moving with his flock. It's a detail easy to skim past, but it's not incidental. Across the ancient world, the friction between people who till and people who herd shows up again and again, in story after story, long before Cain and Abel, and long after them. Two ways of surviving off the same land, each with its own rhythms, its own claims, its own vulnerabilities. This isn't the last time Genesis will use that exact tension. A farmer and a herder, a favored brother and a passed-over one, as the seedbed for a family fracture. Each brother brings an offering. The text doesn't dwell on ritual instruction, because there isn't a temple yet, no priesthood, no fixed system of sacrifice like the one Israel will receive centuries later at Sinai. This is something closer to the beginning of the beginning, worship still finding its shape. What the text does tell us is simpler and starker. One offering is regarded. One isn't, and Cain's face falls. Here's where God speaks, and this is the part that gets skipped in almost every retelling of this story, because everyone remembers the murder and forgets the warning that came first. Before anything happens to Abel, God speaks directly to Cain, not in judgment, in counsel. Sin, God tells him, is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. It's about as direct an intervention as Scripture records anywhere, a warning, delivered in advance, naming the exact danger Cain is standing next to, and naming that Cain still has power over what happens next. He doesn't rule over it. What happens next is brief, and the text doesn't linger on it. A field, two brothers, and then one, and immediately the world Cain has to answer to isn't a courtroom, and it isn't a formal legal code, because none of that exists yet. What exists is a much older, rawer logic. Kin protects kin, and blood answers blood. If you belong to a family or a clan in this world, and someone in it is killed, the expectation isn't that a judge intervenes. The expectation is that someone close to the victim will. This is the backdrop pulsing underneath everything that's about to happen to Cain, not written law, but the oldest form of justice there is, the kind carried by relatives rather than courts. So when God turns to Cain with a question, "Where is your brother?" it isn't information God is missing, it's an echo. This is the second time in 2 chapters God has asked a question he already knows the answer to. He asked Adam, "Where are you?" after the fruit was eaten. Now he asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" after the blood is spilled. 2 questions, back to back across 2 generations, both offering the same quiet opening, a chance to answer honestly, before judgment falls. Cain doesn't take it. He answers with a question of his own, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the ground itself becomes the next witness against him. His brother's blood, the text says, is crying out from it. This is the moment the mark belongs to. Not an isolated verse floating on its own, but the final beat in a sequence that runs, warning ignored, question refused, blood exposed, judgment pronounced. Whatever this sign turns out to mean, it's spoken into that specific moment, a world with no courts, no formal justice, only kinship-based vengeance, and a man who has just made himself its first target. Which means, before we can understand what the mark protects Cain from, we have to sit for a moment inside the judgment God has just handed down, because the punishment comes before the protection, and the two are not the same thing. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. A fugitive and a wanderer you shall be on the earth." Slow down on one word here, because it's easy to read past it. Ground. Cain isn't simply told he did wrong. He's told the very thing he built his identity on. The soil, the crop, the work of his hands, will now resist him. This is a man whose whole life has been organized around one relationship, farmer to field. And that relationship is the one God severs. Here's the detail worth sitting with. This isn't the first time the ground has been cursed in Genesis. 3 chapters earlier, after Adam's disobedience, God tells him the ground itself is cursed because of him. Thorns, thistles, sweat, difficulty, but still workable, still able to yield food with enough effort. What happens to Cain is worse. His curse isn't general hardship, it's targeted, personal, and total. The ground will no longer yield to him at all. Think of it like 2 different verdicts, handed to 2 different generations. The first is a fine, painful, ongoing, but survivable, built into the cost of living. The second is something closer to a lifetime ban, revoked privileges, a door closed specifically and only to him. Adam's sin cursed the ground for humanity in general. Cain's sin curses the ground specifically toward Cain. The first judgment was shared. The second is personal. And it's worth noticing that this happens exactly once more in the entire Genesis narrative, the ground being cursed a second, individual time, because Genesis is quietly building a pattern here. Sin doesn't just damage the sinners standing before God. In this world, it damages the very earth's relationship to the one who sinned. But that only accounts for half of what Cain is told. He's also called a fugitive and a wanderer, and that phrase is about to become the hinge the rest of this video turns on. Cain hears the sentence, and his response is not what we might expect from someone who has just avoided immediate execution. "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Notice what Cain is actually afraid of. Not primarily the loss of land, though he mentions it. Not primarily separation from God's presence, though he mentions that too. What he names last, and dwells on, is the fear of being killed by whoever finds him. This is a strange thing to fear, if you stop and think about it. As far as the narrative has told us, Cain's family consists of his parents, and, now, no surviving siblings. So who is whoever? Scripture doesn't resolve this for us directly. Genesis 4 and 5 both gesture toward other children of Adam and Eve beyond the 3 we're named, but the text never gives us a census. This is a long recognized puzzle, not a modern skeptical objection, and it's honest to say plainly, we don't get a clean answer here. What we do get is Cain's assumption, spoken with total confidence, that a world exists beyond his family, capable of finding him and killing him for what he's done. Here's why that detail matters more than it first appears to. Cain isn't inventing an abstract fear. He's speaking the logic of a world Genesis assumes but doesn't fully narrate. A world where killing a family member obligates that family to respond in kind. Kin avenges kin. Blood answers blood. It's not written law yet, because there's no law code in this world to write it into. It's older than that. It's simply how survival and justice work when there's no court to appeal to. A pattern attested widely across the ancient world, and one Israel's own later law will eventually have to formally regulate rather than invent from nothing. Picture it like the difference between a modern justice system and something closer to a small, ungoverned frontier. No police, no judge, no prison. In a world like that, justice doesn't come from an institution. It comes from whoever's angriest and closest to the victim. Cain, in other words, isn't panicking over nothing. He's read the room correctly. He has taken a life in a world that runs on lives being answered for, and he knows, better than we often give him credit for, exactly what that means for him now. It's worth noticing, centuries later, how seriously Israel's own law would come to take this exact fear. When God gives Israel instructions for the Promised Land, he commands the setting apart of cities of refuge, places a person who has taken a life could flee to and receive a fair hearing before the community, protected from the avenger of blood until the matter could be judged. The system draws a careful line the text is very deliberate about. Refuge is for the person who killed without intent, without hatred, by accident. Someone who strikes another out of premeditated hostility receives no such protection. The avenger is still permitted to act. That distinction matters here, and it should be stated honestly rather than smoothed over. Cain's killing of Abel is not accidental. There's no ambiguity about intent in Genesis 4. Cain leads his brother out to the field, and the warning God gave him beforehand makes clear this wasn't a sudden loss of control he never saw coming. By the standard Israel's own later law would set, Cain would not qualify for the protection those cities were built to offer, which makes what actually happens to him stranger, not simpler. God doesn't formalize a legal process for Cain the way Numbers 35 will formalize one for Israel centuries later. There's no trial, no elders, no city gate. There's just God, speaking directly, choosing to protect a man whose case wouldn't have met the threshold his own future law would set for protection at all. Which is precisely the moment God does something that doesn't fit the pattern Cain is bracing for. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Read that again, slowly, because there are two separate actions happening in that single verse, and it's worth separating them. First, God issues a warning, a promise of consequence, sevenfold, against anyone who kills Cain. Second, and distinct from the first, God places something on Cain himself, a sign. Two different mechanisms, working together, both aimed at exactly one outcome, that Cain does not die at someone else's hand. Here's the overlooked detail, and it's the one this entire video has been circling since the opening moments. Go back and read the verse again. It doesn't say the sign identified Cain as a murderer. It doesn't say the sign made his guilt visible to others, so that they would know to shun him or shame him. The text is remarkably restrained about this. It gives exactly one stated function for the mark, and only one, lest any who found him should attack him: protection. Nothing else is written into the verse. This is worth pausing on, because almost everything popular imagination has added to the mark of Cain, the idea that it broadcast his guilt, that it functioned as a public brand of shame, even historically damaging misreadings that tied it to something as unrelated as skin color, misreadings with a documented and painful history that this video wants no part of repeating, comes from outside the text. None of it is in Genesis 4:15. What's actually there is narrower and stranger, a sign whose only stated job was to keep other people from killing him. And it's worth being honest that the text never tells us what this sign physically was. Not a mark on the forehead, not a specific wound, not an animal horn, nothing visual we can picture with any confidence. Jewish and Christian interpreters have proposed all of these across the centuries, and none of them can be stated as fact. What we actually have is simpler than any of those guesses, and, in a way, more interesting. A word and a stated purpose, and nothing more. Try holding both halves of this moment in view at once. In the same breath, God judges Cain, cursed ground, exile, a fractured relationship with the land that fed him, and God protects Cain, guaranteeing on the record that whatever else happens to him, he will not die at another person's hand for this. Not one or the other, both together, inside a single verse. That's strange enough to sit with on its own, but there's a linguistic detail sitting quietly inside this verse that makes it stranger still. A single Hebrew word, doing exactly this kind of work, twice more before Genesis is even finished. And once you see where else that word shows up, the mark stops looking like an isolated act of restraint and starts looking like something with a much longer memory. If you've never noticed that before, that Genesis 4:15 never actually says the mark was about shame, only about safety. That's the kind of detail this channel is built around. Scripture holds details like this, quietly, in plain sight, waiting for someone to slow down and actually read the sentence instead of the tradition built on top of it. If that's the kind of study you want more of, this is a good moment to subscribe, because we go looking for exactly this every week. Because there's a word sitting inside that verse we haven't looked at closely yet, the word behind mark itself. And it turns out this is not the only place in Genesis where God reaches for it. The word behind mark in Genesis 4:15 is oth. It's a common enough word. It simply means a sign, something visible or perceptible that points beyond itself to a meaning. On its own, it doesn't carry any built-in connotation of shame or of protection. It's a neutral term. Context decides what kind of sign it is, so it's worth asking a simple question. Where else does Genesis use this exact word? Not far away, as it turns out. 6 chapters later, the flood has receded. Noah and his family have stepped back onto dry ground, into a world that's just been washed clean of nearly everyone in it. And God makes a promise, not a vague sentiment, but a formal, binding commitment never to destroy the earth by flood again. And to seal that promise, God gives something visible. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Sign, same Hebrew word, oth. Here's the detail worth pausing on. The rainbow isn't decoration. It isn't a reward for good behavior. It's a covenant sign, something God attaches to a promise, so that every time it's seen by anyone, it testifies to a commitment God has bound himself to keep. That's what this word is doing in Genesis 9. Not exposing anyone, not marking anyone as guilty, guaranteeing a promise. Hold that thought and go forward 8 more chapters. God is establishing his covenant with Abraham now, the one that will eventually become the entire story of Israel. And the physical mark God attaches to that covenant is circumcision. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Sign, again, the same word. So now, look at what's actually happening across these 3 passages. 3 times in the book of Genesis, God places a visible oth, a sign, on something or someone. Once on a murderer, right after the first killing in human history. Once on the sky itself, after the flood. Once on the body of a man who will become the father of a covenant nation. And every single time this word appears, without exception, in these 3 uses, it is doing the same job, marking a promise God intends to keep. This is where it's worth being honest about what can and can't be claimed here. The word oth is broad. It's used elsewhere in Scripture for things that carry no covenant weight at all, like the sun, moon, and stars marking seasons in Genesis 1. Not every instance of this word is a covenant sign. That has to be said plainly, or the connection gets overstated. But within Genesis specifically, within the same book spanning just 17 chapters, the 3 most theologically weighted uses of this word all share the same structure. God speaks a promise, and then God attaches a visible sign to guarantee it. And the first of those three signs, chronologically, textually, the very first time this word does this kind of work in all of Scripture, isn't the rainbow, it isn't circumcision, it's Cain. Sit with that for a moment, because it reorders something. We tend to assume Cain's mark is the strange outlier, the dark exception sitting awkwardly next to two clearly gracious, covenantal signs. But the order runs the other way. Cain's mark isn't the exception borrowing the reputation of the rainbow and circumcision, it's the pattern's first appearance. The rainbow and circumcision are the ones that come after, using the same vocabulary Cain's story already established. Which means the question this video opened with, why did God put a mark on Cain instead of killing him, may be built on a hidden assumption that doesn't survive contact with the Hebrew text. The question assumes the mark and the mercy are two separate things. First, God spares him, and then, almost as an afterthought, gives him some kind of sign. But that's not what the grammar of Genesis is doing. The sparing is the sign. The mark isn't evidence that God went easy on a murderer. It's evidence that God was already speaking the language of covenant, binding promise, sealed with a visible guarantee, over the very first person in Scripture who least appeared to deserve one. That doesn't erase what Cain did. The ground is still cursed toward him specifically. The exile is still real, still severe, still named as more than he feels he can bear. But sitting right alongside that judgment, in the very same verse, is a word Genesis will use again and again for God's most solemn promises, and this is the first time it's ever spoken. It's worth watching, too, what Cain does with the life he's just been guaranteed. He goes out from the Lord's presence and settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden, and it's hard not to notice the echo. This is the second time in 2 chapters someone has walked away from God's presence heading east. Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden and settled east of it, cherubim guarding the way back with a flaming sword. Now their son walks the same direction, out of the same presence, into the same kind of exile, one generation deeper. The pattern isn't subtle once you see it. 2 departures, 2 curses on the ground, 2 versions of distance from God's face, each one echoing and extending the one before it. And what does Cain do once he's out there, unprotected by land or standing, carrying nothing but a promise that no one is allowed to kill him? He builds a city, names it after his son. It's the first recorded act of urban civilization in Scripture, and it comes directly on the heels of exile. A man who has lost his relationship to open ground, responding by building walls of his own. Whatever else that detail means, it's worth noticing the contrast. God gave Cain a guarantee written in a word reserved for covenant promises. Cain, for his part, seems to have gone looking for security anyway, on his own terms, brick by brick. That instinct doesn't stay contained to 1 generation. 2 generations later, Cain's descendant Lamech stands before his wives and makes a boast that should stop us cold if we're paying attention. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. He's taken the exact number God spoke over Cain, 7-fold vengeance, reserved for God to enforce, never handed to Cain himself as a personal weapon, and multiplied it into a private code of retaliation, self-authorized, answering to no one. What God spoke as restraint, 2 generations pass, and it becomes a boast. It's a sobering footnote to everything that came before it. The sign God gave Cain was never a license for Cain, or anyone descended from him, to start avenging himself. It was a promise God made and kept on Cain's behalf. Lamech's version is what it looks like when someone takes that same vocabulary and turns it into something God never authorized. Pull back far enough, though, and it becomes one picture, a field, and a body, and a man who cannot stop walking east, a voice asking a question it already knows the answer to. The second time, in 2 chapters, God has asked something he didn't need answering. Ground that has already been cursed once, for everyone, now cursed a second time, for one man alone. A fugitive who names his own fear out loud, certain that somewhere out past his family's tents, someone is waiting to finish what he started. And then, in the middle of all of that, Judgment still standing, curse still spoken, exile still real. A single word, sign, not shame, not exposure, not a brand meant to warn the world what kind of man was walking through it. A promise. The same word Genesis will use for a bow bent across the sky after the water finally recedes. The same word Genesis will use for a mark cut into Abraham's own body, sealing a covenant that will carry his name for 4,000 years. 3 signs, 1 book, 1 pattern, a murderer, a flood survivor, a father of nations, and the first one comes first, not the rainbow, arching gently over a world washed clean. Not circumcision, marking the beginning of a chosen family. Cain, cursed, exiled, terrified, and still, somehow, the very first person in Scripture to receive this word from God's mouth. The first covenant sign in the Bible isn't given to someone who earned it. It's given to someone who, by every measure the story gives us, deserved the opposite. That's the part that doesn't sit easily. That's the part worth sitting with anyway. Because the question this video opened with, why a mark instead of death, was never really the mystery it seemed to be. The mystery wasn't whether God would show mercy. The mystery was what kind of mercy this actually was. Not a reduced sentence, not a technicality, a promise, spoken in the same breath as a curse, sealed with the same word God will use again over a rainbow, and again over Abraham. Judgment and covenant in a single verse, both true, neither canceling the other out. That's the ground Cain walked out on. That's the sign he carried east with him, into a world full of strangers who might have killed him, and, because of one word spoken over him first, never could. Every one of us knows what it's like to expect the door to close, to have done the thing, said it, broken it, walked away from it, and to feel, with total certainty, that whatever comes next has to be worse than what came before. Cain names it out loud. My punishment is greater than I can bear. It's not self-pity, it's arithmetic. He knows what he did. He knows, in the world he lives in, what people who do that usually get. He isn't hoping for mercy when he says those words. He's bracing for the opposite. Most of us have had a version of that moment, maybe smaller, maybe not. The morning after the words, "You can't take back." The silence after the truth comes out. The particular kind of dread that isn't about being caught. It's about already knowing, before anyone says a word, exactly what you deserve. And in that moment, most of us do what Cain does. We start walking. We put distance between ourselves and the place it happened, the people who witnessed it, sometimes even God himself. Cain describes his exile, without being asked, as being hidden from God's face, not just cast out from land, cast out from presence. That's the part of this story that doesn't stay ancient for long, because what happens next isn't what Cain braced for, and it isn't what most of us brace for either. God doesn't erase what happened. The ground stays cursed. The exile stays real. Nothing about the consequence disappears. But in the same breath as that judgment, God speaks a word he will use exactly twice more in the rest of Genesis, both times over people he is making an unbreakable promise to. That's not a story about escaping consequences. Cain still walks east. Cain still wanders. Whatever this is, it isn't a loophole. It's something quieter than that, and maybe harder to sit with. It's the possibility that judgment and covenant were never actually opposites, that God can hold both at once, fully, without either one canceling the other out. That the worst thing you've done, and the promise God is willing to keep over you, can occupy the very same verse. Cain never asked for the sign. He asked, if anything, only to survive. And what he got instead was a word Scripture would later use for a rainbow stretched over the whole earth, and for a covenant that would outlast empires. Maybe that's worth sitting with a little longer than the story usually gets. Not because it excuses what he did, because it says something about what God does with people who least expect to still be spoken to at all. God didn't wait for Cain to deserve the sign. He gave it to him on the way out the door. If this changed the way you'll read that word mark from now on, there's more of Scripture waiting to be looked at this closely. Subscribe to the Scripture Project, and if someone you know needs to hear that judgment and mercy can live in the very same verse, send them this one.